Hi, guys. Hope everybody's doing well today. And just wanted to reach out to you and do this module work with you. Today's module is going to be called Haunted Marion. So we usually like to do this around Halloween time with our first semester kids, and it usually is part of a larger unit called Folklore and Legends. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple of stories to you in this book called Haunted Marion. I know it shows up backwards for you, but Haunted Marion is the book. Some of you might even have this. It's authored by Josh Simpkins. He's actually a friend of mine, guy I graduated with and kind of palled around with when I was a kid. I've picked 3 stories out of this book to kind of share with you. And there's also an assignment that goes with this where I want you to share with me some of your interesting stories or interesting things that you've heard yourself. So let's get to it. What do you say? All right. So today I'm going to start our conversation today. And I guess you could follow along if you have this book with you. We're going to start on page 101, and we're going to talk about the downtown YMCA. Now, what I want to do, what I think it might be interesting to do, is to share with my screen with you. And I'm working on that now. So let me share my screen with you because I've got some things I want to do with you here. There, you should see my screen. I should be in a little box here to the right. And let's see. Let's go right here. August 22nd, 1974. Check this out. This is the front page of the Marion Star. Thursday, August 22nd, 1974. City police lack suspect or weapon in YMCA killing. We're going to talk to you about that. It's really kind of interesting. So just let me read. So, if you want to make this really cool, I know a lot of you listen to this late at night. So if you want to maybe turn the lights down and listen to this story, it might be good. Okay. All right. So the downtown YMCA. Now, this is the YMCA that is right beside Heritage Hall. The old Y, I think today it's called the B Church. Here we go. By the time the Church Street YMCA closed its doors in 2004, stories that it was haunted had been circulating for years around Marion. The majority of these stories seemed to focus on the 3rd floor, where the jogging track was located in the final couple of decades of the Y's operation. Like most ghost stories, they were always vague and went something like this. Hey, I heard that sometimes you can hear footsteps on the track when nobody's there. What a lot of people don't realize is that this particular rumor probably has its roots in an actual tragedy that took place on the 3rd floor of the Y in 1974. The YMCA on Church Street was built in 1953 to replace the original, which was located just around the corner on South State Street. Today, most people around Marion tend to think of the Y as primarily a place to work out. However, affordable sleeping rooms were also once a common feature of many of the YMCAs, and the Church Street YMCA was no exception. The sleeping rooms were, in fact, located on the 3rd floor. I always like to tell my students, think of that song, YMCA, right? It's fun to stay at the YMCA, right? I'm not a singer, but you know that song, right? You can have a good meal, right? You can have a good time. You can have a great meal, right? It used to be a place where you could get a room and stay. The YMCA wasn't just a workout place. On August 21st, 1974, a cleaning woman found 20-year-old Ronald McDaniel dead in his room on the 3rd floor of the Y. The Marion County coroner said that he had died of multiple stab wounds sometime during the night. By all accounts, McDaniel was a quiet, hardworking young man who was well liked by everyone. And his murder both horrified and outraged Marion. Because some of the belongings were missing, police soon suspected that Ronald's murder was simply a robbery that had gone horribly wrong. On August 30th, police charged a 30-year-old Toledo man who was also renting a room on the 3rd floor of the Y, a guy named Terry Lee Lampkin, with McDaniel's murder. Ironically, Lampkin had already been arrested after the murder on an unrelated charge. In Lampkin's car, police found a knife they believed to be the murder weapon, and a woman who had dated Lampkin testified that he had stopped by her place and dropped off a small television, a tape recorder, a toolbox, all of which had belonged to Ronald McDaniel. In what the Marion Star called a stunning reversal, Lampkin suddenly decided to plead guilty in the murder of Ronald McDaniel on January 14, 1975, just before the second day of his trial was about to get underway. The months leading up to the trial, he had maintained his innocence. Lampkin's lawyers refused to comment on why their client had suddenly changed his mind. Perhaps he felt guilty, or perhaps he realized he stood very little chance of winning his case in the face of such overwhelming evidence against him. In any case, Judge Robert Kelly prompted sentencing Lampkin to 15 years to life, and that was the end of his trial. Is the tragic murder of Ronald McDaniel the origin of the Church Street YMCA's supposed third floor ghost? It would certainly make sense. In March 2011, I, the author, Josh Simpkins, once again talked to Darcy Hunley of the local ghost hunting group Erie Paranormal. I had interviewed her in November 2010 about an investigation that her group had carried out at the receiving vault at the Marion Cemetery. And a few months later, she dropped me a line to say that her group would be conducting an investigation of the downtown YMCA in February. When I talked to her a few weeks after the team wrapped up its investigation, she filled me in on what they'd found. Turns out that the local company, Quality Masonry, owns the building. Now, this was obviously before the B Church took it over. After Darcy called there and left a message explaining who she was and what her group did, a man named Jeff Johnson called her back. Jeff is more or less the caretaker of the building, and Darcy said that he was surprisingly open to the idea. It turns out that he's had a few experiences in the building himself, and he was hoping that Erie Paranormal could, quote, prove that I'm not crazy. So on a cold February night, Erie Paranormal, who's made up of Holly Beard, Bob Lawhun, Terry Mead, Darcy Hunley, Ben Mead, Rusty Beard, and Gary Hunley, settled in at the Y. Before leaving them, Jeff Johnson did a walkthrough to make sure that the building was empty. He also turned up the boiler for them. For obvious reasons, they focused their efforts on the third floor track, and this is where they collected all of that evidence that they posted later on their website. Before they carried out their investigation, Jeff Johnson had told them about his experience with the third floor. While standing outside of the building one time, Jeff looked up to the third floor windows facing Church Street, and he saw a man standing there in a white t-shirt, despite the fact that he knew no one was in the building. As it turns out, Darcy also collected evidence from the Church Street side of the track. She told me that shortly after setting up for the night, she took some photos of what appeared to be an empty track. However, when she examined them after the investigation, she said that the shape of a man is visible in a couple of them. In addition to the photos, they also captured voices on tape. Although I would assume that any voices captured on third floor would be male, in the 1974 murder, both the assailant and the victim were men. The voices appear to be a mixture of both men and women. In addition to the third floor, the group also decided to check out the basement. Jeff Johnson had suggested that they make this part of their investigation because he's had a few experiences that he couldn't easily explain, like doors slamming when they shouldn't. Although the group did indeed have one uncanny experience in the basement, Darcy said that when she and teammate Terry opened the door to the basement, they clearly heard movement in the dark. They were unable to document any significant activity down there. After their investigation, Darcy told me that she had gone over the evidence with current owners, and they thought that the material Erie Paranormal had collected was compelling enough to warrant a follow-up investigation. Of course, if the building sells, they might not get the chance. But if the sale of the old YMCA means the building would once again be put to good use, even Marion's local ghost hunters might approve. So there you go. You get the Marion Star and this murder that actually happened there at the YMCA. Now, speaking of real life things that happen, let's move now to another story. This one is interesting, no doubt. Let's check this out. For this one, we're going to go to Nelson Street. Now, those of you that have any idea where Nelson Street is in town, and again, if you're looking on my screen, you'll notice that here's West Center Street and here's Moto Mart. So Nelson is off of Waterloo and Bennett. So here's David's, and you turn right on Bennett if you're coming down David's, or left if you're coming off the overpass here. And you go down to Waterloo, and Nelson is this one little dead-end street right there. Now, we talked before why this would be a dead-end street because, believe it or not, and our guy's going to drop here, but there used to be a railroad track that would have run right there. So Nelson Street is cut off. Now, interestingly, some of you may know where this is. Now, this is Waterloo. Okay. So, again, a lot of you have an idea where this is. This is Nelson. Now, unfortunately, the Google car didn't go down Nelson Street, but it's the last house on the left down here, 770. This is what the house looks like today, or at least this is what the auditor's website has the house looking like today. This is 770 Nelson. This is where we're going to tell you about this event that took place. Here we go. This is Josh Simpkins again writing. A girl I went to school with, I'll call her Lisa, contacted me a while back to say that she grew up in a house haunted by the spirit of a man who had died there. Her story, whether one chooses to believe it or not, has one aspect that's undeniable. The house located on 770 Nelson Street does have a very unpleasant history. The story really begins on Easter Sunday of 1960. Here you see the Marion Star I've got up on our screen here for you. This is from April 18th of 1960. This is the Monday after Easter Sunday. You can look at that as I read. The story really begins on Easter Sunday of 1960. Two girls, 18-year-old Virginia Napper and her younger sister, 15-year-old Edna May, creep up the stairs. Edna May has removed her shoes as to make as little noise as possible. Their mother is cooking Easter dinner, and their father is sleeping in the upstairs bedroom. Ostensibly, the girls have gone upstairs to wake their father. Instead, Virginia loads a .22 caliber rifle, slips into her father's bedroom, and with Edna May watching, points the muzzle at her father's head. Virginia then pulls the trigger. At first, police are puzzled by the girls' actions. Here you see the girls down here. And I'll just zoom in just a little bit so you can see them. There you go. There's Mr. Napper to the left, and then the two girls, Virginia and Edna May. Virginia was the oldest sister. At first, police are puzzled by the girls' actions. Both the girls freely admit to taking part in the killing, but their motive for wanting their father dead isn't clear, at least initially. Marion City Police Chief Justin Cornley, in a statement to the Marion Star, says only that the girls' father had, quote, picked on them. However, it soon becomes clear that Mr. Napper had done more than merely pick on his daughters. According to Mrs. Napper, the family, which also included two grade school-age boys, were terrified of Mr. Napper. In the words of Mrs. Napper's brother, he treated my sister and her whole family like dogs. However, it was his two daughters whom he had brutalized the most. In an interview with the Star, Mrs. Napper said that her husband had been molesting Virginia for years, and shortly before his death, he had begun molesting Edna May as well. Despite the fact that Mr. Napper had threatened to kill the girls if they ever told anyone about the abuse, they eventually confided to their mother what their father was doing to them. It wasn't long thereafter that the girls decided to kill him, a decision their mother seems to have understood. In her interview with the Star, Mrs. Napper, sobbing with guilt and anger, declared, "I should have killed him myself, then my girls wouldn't be in this trouble." For her part, Lisa, who lived in the house until her family moved out in the mid-1980s, says the family was initially unaware of what had taken place there. It was only after other people told her parents that the family learned about the house's history. Although Lisa and other family members slept in the bedroom where the shooting had taken place, the ghosts seemed to prefer the hallways and stairs, since that's where most of the family members had disquieting experiences. In an email interview, Lisa wrote, "When my sister was younger, she would sit and talk to, quote, that guy in the stairway. My aunt was scared to death to go anywhere near the upstairs, and she actually wigged out one night and said that there was someone behind her, even though she was the only one upstairs. She ended up breaking her fingernails off in the drywall trying to turn the lights on. My mom saw him in the stairway. She said that it was like he was just staring at her. Lisa herself never saw any ghostly activity directly. However, she did say, it always felt like someone was watching or following you. As for the Napper girls, their fates were decided during the summer of 1960. On June 30th of that year, a jury deliberated just over 3 hours before finding Virginia not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Although this meant the possibility that the teenager would have to enter the Lima State Hospital for the criminally insane, it never actually came to that. On Friday, July 7th, 1960, Judge Paul Smith found her to be sane and ordered her immediate release. Prosecutor Robert Stout dropped the charges against Edna May altogether shortly after Virginia's verdict was announced. That the Napper girls didn't receive prison sentences for their killing their father seems, at least in this particular case, decidedly just, especially considering what they had endured at his hands. I apologize for my phone going off there. Obviously, very, very disturbing. I've got one last one here for you. It's called A True Horror Story. Unfortunately, this one happens in 2008. No, I apologize, 1995. So some of you might, unfortunately, have an idea where we are. We're on Silver Street now. A lot of my students have heard this story before, passed down through their families and whatnot. This is a brutal story, but it's one worth covering if we're going to talk about folklore and legend and haunted things that happen in town. This is 306 Silver Street. This is one house from the corner of Commercial. So we're on the farthest, well, not farthest, but we're east of Leader Street, closer towards Prospect Street on Silver and Commercial. So I guess I could do this, right? This is Commercial Street here. And then if we swing down, this is Prospect Street at the end of the street. So that's looking east. And then here's the house we're talking about, 306, this blue one here. You guys know any haunted houses around Marion? It was just an idle question, something to make time go faster at work. It was July 2008, and I had a summer job as a bike mechanic at Rocky's Cyclery. I'd been telling my coworkers about how my nephew and I were kicking around the idea of starting a website devoted to Marion's more macabre side. I know one, said my coworker Fawn. My brother lives next to a supposedly haunted house on Silver Street. Since I'd never heard the story before, I was immediately interested. Yeah, she continued. It's near the corner of Silver and Commercial. Supposedly some guy murdered his family there. And there's this thing with one of the upstairs windows. No matter how many times the owner fixes it, it always breaks again. That's all I've heard, though. Little did I know that my one idle question would lead to a story that by turns documents a terribly depressing tragedy, but also, if one is so inclined to believe it, one of Marion's most haunted houses. I eventually tracked down the story Fawn had mentioned and discovered that she was basically right. Turns out that I hadn't heard the story because I was away at college when it occurred, but I read through the brutal sequence of events that had taken place in the house and soon realized that it was more than just a local spook story. First and foremost, this was a story of real evil perpetrated not by ghosts, but by the living. According to the October 11th, 1995 edition of the Marion Star, Wayne Thomas, a man with a history of domestic violence, murdered his girlfriend, Mary Welcome, and her 9-year-old son, Christopher Hook. On Thursday, October 5th, police speculated that, quote, Thomas beat Welcome's head against the baseboard in the downstairs living room, pinned her to the floor, and strangled her. He continued upstairs and cut Christopher's throat with a butcher's knife. Thomas himself took the easy way out by shooting himself with a massive overdose of insulin. Unfortunately, Mary's father, Charles Hook, made the horrific discovery on Saturday, October 7th, 1995. He'd gone over to the house because he had not heard from his daughter for a few days and had grown worried. Tragically, his concern turned out to be well-founded. The three had arrived in Marion only 6 weeks prior and were renting the house located at 306 Silver Street from Mr. Hook. I eventually published the above information in a slightly different form on the Spooky Marion website in October 2008. I didn't like the story, though. Unlike many of the stories on the website, this one was relatively recent, and that made me uncomfortable. I mean, if the tragic story had happened 100 years ago, there would obviously be no one around who had known and loved the victims. But with this particular story, it's likely that there are a few people who are familiar with, maybe even related to, Mary and Christopher. And you know what? I suppose that's true for us in this class as well. One of the people was Shannon Ward. She contacted me in the early fall of 2010. She had grown up a few houses down from the Hook house, and she shared her personal recollections of Christopher and Mary, her obvious affection for both of them, as well as her sadness at losing them, lends Christopher and Mary a humanity that the facts I gleaned from old editions of the Star cannot. She says, when they first moved in, my brother and I attended the same school as Chris, Oak Street Elementary. We met him at school, and he invited us both to a party his mom was throwing for him. I believe it was a birthday party. We asked our mom, and she said yes and went with us. After that, our moms become good friends. My mom would take Chris to school with us or to the park or vice versa. And on the weekends, my brother and I weren't staying with our father. We'd usually stay at Chris's house, or he'd come hang out at ours. Mary, his mother, was pregnant at the time, and she was due to have a baby in January of 1996. The last day we saw Chris was a rainy Thursday afternoon when my mom picked all of us up from school. I remember sitting in Chris's room playing with a white Play-Doh as my brother and Chris played the Super Nintendo. We were there a few hours when my sister came to get us for dinner. We asked Mom if Chris could stay the night, but she said no because it was a school night. That was the last time we saw them. The next day, my brother and I stopped at their house to get Chris so we could walk to school. I sat on the porch for a few minutes as my brother knocked on the door over and over again. We didn't hear any movement or noise except for an alarm clock going off upstairs. We figured that they had overslept and we would see them later in the day, but Chris never showed up for school and never did come back out to play. If Mary had lived, her daughter would be turning 15 in mid-January and Chris would be turning 25 next year. Even now, they still mean a lot to my family and me. This book was published, in 2010. As for me, I eventually decided to go down to Marion's West End to have a look at the house myself. There wasn't much to see. It was just another rundown house in the rough end of town, my old neighborhood. And that's true. Josh was a buddy of mine. He grew up on the west side, the north side, actually, the northwest side, went to Taft Middle School. It was a rainy winter day, and windows on the upper floors were indeed missing. The house appeared to be abandoned. At the time, whether the house was haunted or not was just speculation. Shannon Ward passed along a few of the stories she'd heard, though I got the feeling that she felt such stories rather cheapened the memory of Mary and Christopher. She says, I've heard several stories about a red ball that would appear in the upstairs hallway and then bounce down the hall by itself into Chris's room. There was also a rumor going around about the child's laughter in the hallway in the middle of the night. I always refused to go in after the murder. It felt wrong to me somehow. Shortly after Shannon got in touch with me, I heard from another woman, Jody Criswell. Like Shannon, she had read about the house on Silver Street, but unlike Shannon, she hadn't known anyone involved in the tragedy that had taken place in 1995. But Jody and her family had actually lived in the house, and she had her own story to tell. On a cold winter day in December 2010, I sat waiting for Jody Criswell and Russell Holycross at the McDonald's on North Main Street. Jody had contacted me a few months earlier, and she'd read about the Silver Street house on the Spooky Marion website. She said that she had lived there from 2008 to June of 2010, and that she had some stories about the house that I might find interesting. When I asked her if she would be willing to sit for an interview, she agreed. Although she and Russell aren't married, they've told me they've been together for more than 20 years and have a bunch of children and grandchildren between them. The following is a condensed version of the interview I conducted with them, and I will make it the last word on the Silver Street house. Well, for you all, that's going to do it. So I'm going to take this down here for a moment and bring back up my screen. If we do that, you should be able to see me in the book. Again, remember, this is Haunted Marion, and it's by Josh Simpkins. Some of you have a copy of it, some of you don't. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope all is well. I hope you're continuing to do your work and do all the things that you need to do to be successful in all your classes. So do the assignment. You'll notice that I've got a little assignment there for you. It should be fun. And I want you to have fun with it. Okay? Take care. See you. Bye.